In this session, we want to talk about dynamic memory. Now here we have a Hyper-V host. This is the computer, the server, that we would have installed the Hyper-V role on. And if our server for operating system is standard, we're going to be able to install 2 virtual machines. If it's a data center, then we're going to be able to install an unlimited number of virtual machines. Now, when we are installing the virtual machine, one of the settings that we configure is the memory. Memory has to be allocated to the virtual machine. And that memory is based on the amount of memory that you have for the Hyper-V host itself. Let's say that you had 32 gig for your memory for the Hyper-V host. And you have 2 virtual machines. You then have to decide how much memory you're going to give or allocate to each virtual machine. Let's say we allocate 8 gigs of memory to one of the virtual machines that we're setting up. We have 2 types of memory that we could set up or configure. We have static memory and we have dynamic memory. Let's take a look at the machine settings, the virtual machine settings for dynamic memory. Here we have our options that we can configure, and here we have a startup RAM. Startup RAM is the amount of memory that you're going to need to start the virtual machine. Now, the virtual machine needs more memory at startup than it uses when the virtual machine is at a steady state. And if you allocate a certain amount of memory for the virtual machine, and that memory is a static memory, it means that when the machine has started and the machine is in its steady state, that is going to have some excess memory. Because remember, it needs more memory at startup than it needs when it's at a steady state. And what is going to happen is that this memory is not going to be able to be allocated to another virtual machine because it's static. So in 2012, Windows came up with dynamic memory, which works a bit differently. With dynamic memory, the memory is allocated according to how much memory that virtual machine needs. So then if the virtual machine is using a certain amount of memory and it has excess memory, with dynamic memory, that excess memory is able then to be allocated to another virtual machine. Let's take a look at the settings for dynamic memory. First, we have to enable dynamic memory. You have the minimum RAM and you have the maximum RAM. The minimum RAM here specifies the minimum amount of memory that should be allocated to the virtual machine after the virtual machine has started. Remember, if we give the startup memory up here, which in our case in this diagram is 1 gig, and we don't configure dynamic memory, it means that we have the startup memory, and then when the machine has started, we don't need that much memory anymore, because remember, again, we don't need as much memory when the machine is at a steady state as when we start that machine or when we're starting that machine. But we can't do anything with the access if it's static. So we come back down again to the dynamic memory, and the minimum RAM here will give you the minimum amount that should be allocated after the virtual machine has started. And this value can be as low as 32 megabits to a maximum value equal to what you had set your startup RAM value to be. Then you have the maximum RAM. With the maximum RAM, you are now able to specify the maximum amount of memory that the virtual machine is allowed to use. You can set the value to be as low as the value of the startup RAM to as high as 1 terabyte. However, a virtual machine can only use as much memory as the maximum amount supported by the guest operating system. For example, if you specify 64 gigabits for a virtual machine running a guest operating system that supports a maximum of 32 gig, then the virtual machine cannot use more than 32 gig. Then we have the memory buffer, another setting for dynamic memory. And the memory buffer specifies how much memory Hyper-V will attempt to assign to the virtual machine compared to the amount of memory actually needed by the applications and services running inside the virtual machine. Memory buffer, as you can see here, is actually specified as a percentage because the actual amount of memory that represents the buffer changes in response to changes in memory usage while the virtual machine is running. Then we have our memory weight, and the memory weight provides Hyper-V with a way to determine how to distribute memory among virtual machines. If there is not enough physical memory available in the computer to give every virtual machine its requested amount of memory. We're going to take a look at the memory settings of a virtual machine. On the Server Manager dashboard, we want to click on Tools, Hyper-V Manager. Within Hyper-V Manager, we now want to create the virtual machine. So we're going to right-click on the host. I'm going to click on New Virtual Machine. On the Before You Begin screen, we want to click on Next. And we want to give a name for the virtual machine. And this is the name that will be displayed in Hyper-V Manager. And we're going to call the virtual machine MCSA Virtual. We have a default location for this machine. As you notice, the default location is in Windows. And we can store the virtual machine as it is in its default, or we can click Store the Virtual Machine in a different location, and we can browse to change the location of the machine. For our purposes in this lab, we're going to leave it at the default location, and we're going to click on Next. Here we have the opportunity to assign memory, and here we can specify the amount of memory to allocate to the virtual machine. And we're going to leave it at the startup memory here of 512 because we're going to change that a little later. We can also do dynamic memory here, but we're going to accept this default and then make the change a little later on in setup. So we're going to click on next to continue. And here we can choose the network adapter. And for this particular lesson, we're going to leave the network adapter as not connected because we can always go back and make that connection. So we're going to click on next to continue. And here we can create a virtual hard disk. And for our example, we're going to choose to create the virtual hard disk later because we can come back, go into settings and create the virtual hard disk later. So we're going to do that. Attach a virtual hard disk later. And we're going to click on next. And we're going to click finish. So now we have a virtual machine and it's called MCSA Virtual. And we want to actually go and look at the dynamic memory settings. So to do that, we want to right click on the virtual machine and we can right click on it when it's in its off state. And we want to click on settings. Or we could also go down to the actions column here and click on settings here. Your choice. So we're going to click on settings. And we're going to click on memory. So we have the startup RAM at 512. And we're going to change that startup RAM to 1024, which is 1 gig. And we're going to enable dynamic memory by clicking in the checkbox here by enable dynamic memory. And we're going to put the minimum RAM to 1024. And you can then change the maximum RAM to whatever you want the maximum RAM to be. You can also change your memory buffer. Remember, for the memory buffer, there's no one size that fits all. It depends on your workload, the percentage that you want to put for that memory buffer. You really do want to avoid a situation where a workload needs memory and Hyper-V has to start looking for it. So you want to set aside memory as a buffer for those situations where you need a lot of memory for a particular workload. So it depends on your situation, the amount of workload that your virtual machine is carrying. Then, of course, we have the memory weight. And this would let us prioritize the availability of memory. Perhaps you have a particular virtual machine that needs a lot more memory than another virtual machine. And this is where you would move the memory rate up or down depending on the amount of memory that is needed for the particular virtual machine. Under the settings of the virtual machine, there's another setting that we want to take a look at here, and it's called Smart Paging. I'm going to click on Smart Paging here, and you can see it's under the Management section. We'll click on Smart Paging. What is Smart Paging? And what does Smart Paging have to do with dynamic memory? Well, let's go back up to memory here. Click on memory and notice that you have the startup RAM here and you also have the minimum RAM, and they actually separate values. This means that if a virtual machine is not using all of the memory that it was initially allocated, then it means that some of that memory can be released. Let's look at a situation. Imagine that a host, which is your Hyper-V host, that's hosting the virtual machines, has been overcommitted. Overcommitted meaning that each virtual machine on that host is using the bare minimum amount of memory, so that all the memory is being used up that is supposed to be allocated to the host. Now imagine that after all the VMs, all the virtual machines have started, that you need to reboot one of those virtual machines. Now remember that when you start a virtual machine, it is going to need more memory than when it is in its steady state. So when the machine reboots and tries to start, it is going to be looking for memory to start. But all that memory would have been given out or allocated to all the other VMs. So there now is no memory or not enough memory for that virtual machine to start because memory is overcommitted. This is where the smart paging file comes in, and let's click back here on smart paging. Rather than allowing the virtual machine boot to fail, the smart paging file is used to make up for the shortages in RAM or memory. Now, Hyper-V allows you to configure that smart paging file's location. So we see here, we can look on the right hand side where we can actually change the location of that file. And by default, the paging file, the smart paging file is stored with the VM, but you can redirect it or you can browse to another location. To recap, dynamic memory is a feature that is designed to compensate for a host server's physical memory limitations, rather than assigning a static amount of memory to a virtual machine. The virtual machine uses the memory that it needs within the limits set by you, the administrator. If, for example, a VM is assigned 8 gig of RAM, but only needs 7.5 gig, then half a gigabyte of memory is being wasted. That half a gigabyte could be better used on another virtual machine. There are 3 settings that you need to pay attention to. You need to pay attention to your startup RAM. This represents the amount of memory that is being statically assigned to the virtual machine. If, however, we had dynamic memory enabled, then the startup RAM value would reflect the amount of memory that is initially assigned to the virtual machine before the dynamic memory feature increases or decreases the memory consumption. And then there are 2 other settings that we had talked about, and that is the minimum RAM and the maximum RAM. And as the names imply, these settings reflect the least and most physical memory that will ever be allocated to the virtual machine. And last of all, but not least, we talked about the smart paging file. And Microsoft allows you to change the location of that smart paging file. And remember that that smart paging file is used if the memory given to the virtual machines, if that memory is overcommitted. It means that each virtual machine is using the bare minimum. If one machine should shut down and that machine needs to reboot or start back, it is going to need extra memory, but all the memory is being used by all the machines. So that's where the smart paging file comes into play. Rather than let that machine that needs to reboot fail, the smart paging file is used to make up for shortages in RAM. Unlike the Windows page file, however, the smart paging file is only used by the boot process. It is not used for routine memory paging operations. And we can see here on the right hand side again that we can change the location of that smart paging file. This is the end of our session on dynamic memory and smart paging. I want to thank you for listening.